The US dollar is under attack, with China trying to rewrite the rules. And according to Wall Street legend Zoltan Pozsar, there's a great power conflict today led by China, which could flip the financial world order. Now, it's not a secret that the world is de-dollarizing. It has been going on for decades, long before the sanctions of 2022. Now, the dollar share of forex reserves has been dropping from over 70% to under 60%. And this started long back in 2008 when the US printed up tons of money to bail out the big banks on Wall Street. Countries were all tired of rising inflation and low yield on US bonds. But as we have all seen, the weaponization of the US dollar has kicked the dollarization into overdrive. The world is trying to get out of the reserve currency. It has triggered a domino effect that's splitting the world into two, right? And China is making bold moves on the world stage. And according to Zoltan, China's proactively writing a fresh set of rules as it replaced the Great Game, creating a new type of globalization. And they are doing that by creating powerful institutions such as the BRICS Plus Group, the SEO, and the Belt and Road Initiative. We could really see an evolution of the world order where we have one world, right, and two systems where it will be divided on the use of the reserve currency, the US dollar. Now, on one side of the world, the West and allies will be relying mainly on dollars to transact and dollar-denominated treasuries to run their economies. It's basically the continuation of the unipolar era with the US as the economic leader since the Cold War. And on the other hand, we will have other countries conducting more bilateral trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar completely like the BRICS group. Plus, they won't be relying solely on US dollar denominated assets to store their reserves. They'll be stockpiling alternatives like gold. And we need to take what Zoltan says seriously. He has correctly predicted the rearmament of the West, the French shoring the supply chains away from China, and the dumping of US treasuries from the East. Now, Zoltan believes that China will be spearheading this campaign against the dollar by attacking the financial order in three ways, which we have to go through today. And once again, I must emphasize that nothing is set in stone, plus, no one can predict timelines. And even if the dollar loses its hegemony, it will still be a major reserve currency because the US economy is still enormous and developed. It won't just have the exorbitant privilege granted by the dollar status anymore, right? It will lose that. They will have to compete on a more equal footing on the world stage, right? Now, the United States isn't finished and no country is going to collapse in 30 days. Now, China has been especially busy in 2022 while the West is focused on the conflict in Ukraine, right? And this goes beyond just buying cheap Russian oil from Putin. Yes, that helps the Chinese economy recover faster, 100% true. But what China is focusing on is consolidating their existing relationships and trying to win over new support from countries on the fence. And let's call them swing states, right? Just like in the elections. Now, these are nations that are on the fence with the United States. They are strategic partners with America, but they are also pissed off at the same time. And a great example is Saudi Arabia, of course. Now, Saudi Arabia is a strategic security partner with the United States, but as we know, relations are rocky after Joe Biden scolded the Saudis for cutting oil production, right? And that's why we saw President Xi fly all the way to Saudi Arabia. He wants to get MBS to break away economically from the United States, and that means selling oil in the Chinese yuan. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened yet, but we have the Saudi finance minister announcing to the whole world at Davos that the kingdom is open to global trade outside of the dollar. And that is already a win, guys, because any trade outside of the dollar is still de-dollarization. It doesn't need to be specifically the yuan. And on the Russian side, Zoltan highlights one key point of cooperation that we have overlooked. He states, this relationship with Russia, with the assistance of global warming, is helping extend China's Belt Road Initiative through Arctic shipping lanes. And this move is important because it opens up a new trading route for China's initiative. They don't need to rely on the traditional trading routes, which have a heavy G7 presence, which could really choke them out. Now we have China and Russia silently expanding their Arctic partnership, building Arctic ports to allow access to new shipping routes. And this allows China and their allies to access shorter and cheaper alternatives to reach international markets. They don't need to rely on sailing through the Suez Canal anymore to reach European or American markets. They can just sail across Russia's North Sea passages across the Arctic, right? And this makes Chinese goods cheaper and more competitive. So, what China is doing is really trying to build benefits for countries to break away from the establishment, right? For example, if you work with the G7, you get full access to the dollar system, Western infrastructure, and technology. Similarly, China is trying to stack the deck for the East, right? So if you work with us, you get benefits like utilizing our Arctic shipping lanes through Russia. And if countries break away to give this a try, it could affect the global economic order. As Zoltan puts it, if the G20 fractures into the camps of G7 plus Australia, BRICS plus, and the non aligned, it is impossible that these risks will not affect the international monetary system. Now, there are a ton of geopolitical risks to the dollar, but let's focus on the de-dollarization efforts. Now, de-dollarization basically means not using the US dollar for trade, holding it as reserves, or buying into dollar-denominated assets like treasuries, right? And this is what China is trying to promote in the world today. So let's take a quick look at some examples of China's maneuvering on the global stage. And the most recent one is China's December trip to Saudi Arabia. They are trying to get the entire Middle East to de-dollarize over time. Now, this is a bold move, we know that. But even if it works, it will still take some time to materialize because getting out of the dollar system isn't that easy. 60% of global trade is still invoiced in dollars, and the same goes for foreign debt issuance. The majority is still in dollars as well. So this push won't be an overnight affair. But I want us to focus on this part of President Xi's speech to the Gulf countries at the summit. He mentioned how in the next 3 to 5 years, China's ready to work with GCC countries in the following priority areas. First, setting up a new paradigm of all-dimensional energy cooperation where China will continue to import large quantities of crude oil on a long-term basis from GCC countries and purchase more LNG. And he goes on to say the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange platform will be fully utilized for yuan settlement in oil and gas trade, and we could start currency swap cooperation and advance the CBDC bridge project. And this tells us that China has a long-term vision for cooperation with the Middle East. They're going to keep being the largest customer of energy from OPEC and slowly help transition the Gulf away from the dollar to the Chinese yuan. China's telling Saudi Arabia and friends, if you need more Chinese yuan for bilateral trade, we will support you with currency swaps and we can do it outside of the dollar system through our CBDC platform. China is trying to swing over the biggest oil producers in the world, OPEC, to trade outside of the dollar. The Middle East is the swing state that China is trying to win over. And we can see that in 2021, OPEC accounts for 35% of the world's oil production, and if we combine it with Russia and China's combined production of nearly 17%, we get over 50% of the world's oil that could get priced away from dollars. As Zoltan points out, with the expansion of BRICS to beyond Brazil, Russia, and India and China, the de-dollarization of trade flows may really spread. And that's why we have been saying endlessly on this channel that the Middle East is the key to the world. They are the kingmakers. But this is just one part of the dollarization. Selling stuff outside of the dollar is just the start. So let's sit back, guys, and understand step 2. Because of the dollarization, countries still need somewhere to reinvest their excess revenues, right? There's no point staying in cash long term because every currency is still fiat. Doesn't matter if the US dollar is the Chinese yuan or Indian rupee. Over the next 10 to 20 years, I think we can all agree, right? Inflation will eat away at their purchasing power. So what are countries going to do? And according to Zoltan, money is not being recycled back into US treasuries. Instead, we have seen more demand for gold, commodities, and geopolitical investments such as funding the Belt Road Initiative and helping allies and neighbors in need like Turkey, Egypt, or Pakistan. And this is perhaps the most important statement that we must pay attention to as investors, right? This is where money is flowing to. This is where the money is actually going into as the dollarization accelerates. And the first is the flow of money into gold. And we can see that 2022 has been an incredible year for central bank gold buying. There have been huge net buyers of gold month after month, even though the prices have been rising, right? And what's interesting is central banks of gold producing nations have been buying a lot more gold than what they are selling. We can see Turkey and China, for example, they have been piling on tons of gold like it is going out of style. And to up the stakes even further, China announced in November and December that they increased their gold reserves. And this is basically a de-dollarization war cry to the world that, hey, we're exiting the dollar and getting into gold big time. But let's talk about Saudi Arabia's push towards investing in commodities as well. Remember that the shift is away from dollar denominated assets into real tangible assets. And this is what Saudi Arabia is doing with their dollar surpluses. They are channeling money into mining investments globally. The Saudis have set up a new firm to invest exclusively in global mining assets, right? They're diversifying away from oil and they want to take equity positions in miners that dig up iron ore, copper, nickel, and lithium. Now, this is big because the Saudis they are shifting towards real hard assets. They believe that commodities will yield a better return over time versus US treasuries, right? They know that we are moving towards a world that needs commodities. We have the West rearming themselves and China building stuff everywhere, so it only makes sense to control the supply, right? And this is another form of de-dollarization that we have to watch out for. And this push is also spilling into geopolitical investments. For example, the Saudis are looking to invest $10 billion into Pakistan and they just signed deals worth over 7 billion with Egypt. Now, they are trying to build goodwill in the region and diversify away from traditional reserve assets like US bonds. And we can expect BRICS and the Saudis to start building more relationships across the world outside of the West. And let's talk about CBDCs because Zoltan postulates that digital currencies will help the world move away from the dollar. Now, this is something that I haven't considered before. I always believed that CBDCs could actually help America spread their influence and secure the dollar's position as the reserve currency. But Zoltan is telling us that the East and the global South could actually use CBDCs to accelerate de-dollarization, right? This could actually be a huge game changer. And he points out how financial sanctions are implemented through the balance sheets of Western banks and that these institutions form the backbone of the corresponding banking system that underpins the dollar. So whether it is the Chinese yuan or new BRICS currency, you need to use a new network to be really sanction proof. And the world is moving towards CBDCs, guys. It's going to come sooner or later. Central banks will be interlinked with each other, cutting away the need for commercial banks, right? And this means that the Chinese central bank can immediately communicate with Saudi Arabia's central bank. There is no need, zero need to go through any intermediary Western bank to do any currency exchange, right? They can conduct trade outside of the dollar in a system that is sanction proof. And that means China can just as easily buy Saudi oil in yuan and the kingdom buying Chinese goods using the rial, and all this will be done on a private digital ledger without touching the Western banking system. And this is groundbreaking because if Zoltan is right, there could be two digital networks in the future, the digital dollar system and the BRICS network, for example, right? And we already have Hong Kong, China, Thailand, and the UAE developing their CBDC network called MCBDC, right? In fact, they have completed the first real trade pilot test using each of the four currencies. And this is very alarming, and that's why we are seeing the US launching their digital dollar pilot program with the Wall Street banks, right? And this is a financial arms race. I really think the bigger agenda behind CBDCs is protecting the reserve status of the US dollar. And Powell himself, he has told us that the digital dollar is all about maintaining the US dollar's global dominance. So this is another arena that we must watch out for. And what's interesting is that Zoltan's article is in response to a British economist's letter on how worries over the loss of dollar dominance are overdone. He's trying to show us the game plan of China and the East. He wants us to know that we have to take in all these geopolitical risks as we invest, right? Because if all goes to plan, we will see fewer dollars being used for global trade. That will also mean fewer dollars will be recycled back into US treasuries. And this is going to affect bond yields, the growth of the US economy, and of course, the price of gold as well. If money is going to flow out of dollar assets, it's definitely going to go into somewhere else, right? And let's remember that you can print as much money as possible, but you cannot print commodities and hard assets. Those are limited in supply. So we got to pay attention to the trend of the dollarization. It doesn't mean that the dollar will evaporate or the US economy will crash. It just means that the exorbitant privilege of the dollar might be coming to an end sooner or later. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Is Zoltan Pozsar right about the dollarization, or is he completely wrong? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.